Welcome to the PI Podcast. I'm your host, Matt, and with me is my co host, political scientist, meme lord, with a face perfectly designed for podcasting, Borge.
Puta, kaysa ba wala tayong video? Ulo ko ito.
It's a mystery.
PI nating lahat. Borge here at your service.
Yes, this is episode 12 of the PI Podcast. But before we get into our main topic, we have an announcement. We have actually, as of this morning, April 8th, we have just ranked number 7 in the political genre in Apple Podcasts and number 51 in the news category. So yay! Thank you for...
Hindi siya 69.
So we first ranked in 69 in episode 1, but now we're starting to... I think it's because of the new content we've been spewing out, like the PI Escuela. So thank you for your support and listening to all of that. So yeah.
Nice.
Anything to say about this new views, this influx of new listeners?
Woo! Marami tayong nauuto. Joke lang, marami tayong nauuto. Maraming salamat sa lahat ng tagapakinig ng PI Escuela. At sana'y kayo patuloy na umantabay sa aming mga ilalabas ng mga bagong episode.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, so for today, we are going to talk about the Catholicism in the Philippines and why is it political. And it is connected to our previous episode in episode 11, which was about colonialism. But this was, besides the circumnavigation of Magellan, it is also the anniversary of the arrival of Catholicism. Because right after Magellan landing here, there was also the celebration of the first Mass, and it has has affected the course of our history forever. So it is intertwined with all our institutions, social, political, and economic. So anything to prologue about that before we move on to our special guest today? Actually, yeah.
I think that's it. The first Mass was held. Limasaw, if I'm not mistaken. Then they had the first converts. I think I mentioned this one during the last episode that Magellan is here to colonize, because if he was not here to colonize, he would not have started converting people. But again, this is there. So we have celebrations in line with that, and it's been part of our history ever since.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel as someone who is less than sympathetic to the Catholic faith? Because as a Catholic myself, although flawed, I'm still quite in line with the Catholic Church, and I'm quite biased. It's flawed, but I still try to work with it. But for you, what do you think about it? And how it affects contemporary politics?
I'm anti-religious, but it's there, so we have to deal with it. And I think it would be quite undemocratic to try to remove it, since it is deeply embedded in consciousness of the majority. So anyway, we'll probably discuss more about religion and politics later on. But for now,
we have a special guest who is a longtime friend of ours, actually, but first-time guest in this podcast. We're very excited to have him here. How long have you known this guest, actually? You've known him longer than
Jules,
I have.
kailan ba nagkilala tayo sa
2012 at least.
2012. Pero nakikita na kita sa department mga 2010 pa lang.
Undergrad ka pa lang.
Wow.
That's a long time.
I have the quote-unquote institutional memory. I've been a student there somehow since 2006.
Yes, long time. And he is current long-time colleague of us. We taught in the same department in the university. He has also taught various subjects in politics and development studies. And right now he is taking his PhD in development studies as well. Please welcome our very good friend, Julien Carandang. Say hello to our listeners.
I'm speechless by Matt's introduction, but having known him, it's kind of expected that he would be, quote-unquote, memorable in his introduction of his guests. But that's his signature, and I will love him for that. And he is the first person in all my 30 plus years that I am What? Julian ba yun? How did you
Oh, I'm
pronounce
sorry.
my name? That is the
I'm
first
very,
time
I'm very nervous.
I've ever heard that. And
Julian Carandang.
that
Oh
itself
gosh.
is going to
Forgive me. Yeah.
be a signature
But
of me introducing myself.
buti nga hindi naging miss eh. Dati miss ka. Sulat. Miss Julien Carandang daw sa
Oh
sulat.
gosh.
Oh yeah. Ano yan? Sakit na yan ng experience ko in the sense na college to So pag hindi ko issue yan since kindergarten hanggang high school, since LSGH ako. So all Mr. and then you are addressed by your last name. Pag pumasok ka ng college, somehow everyone is familiar, first name basis kayo, right? Pero hindi ka pa nakikilala ng prof mo because it's the first day. Check sila na attendance. Just because they see someone as Julian, miss na automatic. To the point, because they do not see a female face in the crowd, usually, absent kagad ako. Tataas ka ng kamay, hindi ikaw i-acknowledge dahil it does not conform to the traditional context of this name, this gender.
Right.
Diba? So, may ganun kagad. So, I'm used to it or I'm used to people mispronouncing my name. Although,
Misgendering.
not necessarily, but more so yung Julien, nagiging Julian.
Yeah.
So,
may bago na ngayon. Julian na ngayon.
Julian na ngayon.
It's very Spanish, actually. Which escapes to the theme. Well, clearly, as our audience can notice, he is a colorful storyteller. But right now, we want to talk about your career as a scholar. And it's quite peculiar because we know you as someone who is focused in food security. But in your undergraduate and graduate studies, you focused on church and state issues. Can you tell us something about that particularity with regards to your academic journey?
Well, it has more to do with my family background. So first and foremost, when I was teaching, my basic introduction to my students is, I am as Lasallian as they come. My name is on the wall of LaSalle, literally. My name is on the wall of the alumni wall in LaSalle. And more importantly is the fact that I might have taught in the liberal arts, but my pseudo training has always been in the sciences. And that's because my dad was a former dean of the College of Science, and he's a biologist. And there is that rational aspect of the natural sciences that I grew up with. But I've always had an appreciation for the social sciences. So I tried to, quote unquote, apply both in the context of what I want to do and where my foundation is. Long story short, when I was doing my PhD, it was time for me to apply what I learned being my dad's RA and having both grown into my own appreciation of the social sciences into something that is relevant to both natural sciences, environmental politics, and sustainability sciences and all of that into food security. That's my PhD. But when we're talking about the context of what we're going to talk about right now, I just fell into it. I had no inclination growing up. I had no actual direct appreciation for studying relationship of church and state. Although my family has been traditionally very religious in that, especially on both sides of the family, there would be at least one priest in a generation, or we would have very, shall we say, very religious personalities in the family. These people really do volunteer work, so forth and so on. So it was natural, whether that volunteer work might be as a minister or might be, in my case, when I did volunteer work, I was part of the choir. My brother, for his part, is a Knights of the Altar. So there are many aspects in how I was brought up wherein, not so much encouraged, but wherein we appreciate when we have members of the family to have active participation in church activities or in church rites if they eventually become religious themselves. So there's a difference of being suspicious, worry, or being just it being a part of you growing up. These things, these nuances. And aside from that, there is also the sense of having to separate your religiosity versus to you as a person. So with regards to how you live your life as a quote-unquote a person of faith is a matter of how you want people to also engage you. Siwerte ako dahil hindi naman pinipilit na magsimba, pero kung magsisimba ka, quote-unquote, seryosohin mo yung pagsisimba mo. You're not going there for the sake of attendance. You're going there because you believe you will do your part. So there's a different appreciation there. But that doesn't mean na lahat ay susundin mo, gugulong ka, luluhod ka sa baklaran, gagapang ka. Iba na yun. But we don't judge. Rather, you live your life the way that is, quote-unquote, works for you. Gumagana sa'yo.
Right.
And because of that, iba rin ang appreciation ko when doing my study on church and state. Hindi ko pinapasukan siya ng faith. Hindi ko sinisingit yung FAITH pagdating sa how I look into it, how I study it, because you must always be philosophical in the context of FAITH. But you cannot separate that from the socio-cultural aspect. Pero you can be objective in your analysis. So paano mo sisimplihin yan? Dali lang yan. You take the faith system out of the analysis of the religion. So iba na ngayon ang mindset mo. Religion mo siya i-analyze based sa kung ano yung kanyang contribution sa history, sa society, sa culture, sa community. Hindi mo siya i-analyze based on sa veracity, sa truth, sa logic ba man lang ng faith system. Dahil iba yun philosophy yun Hindi naman yun ang discussion natin Pag dun pa lang ma-separate mo na, hindi na siya issue of bias. Issue na siya ng value or how valuable that religion is to that particular context of community and the people and the culture. So that's how I've always seen it.
Right. It's quite interesting because most church and state scholars in the Philippines also happen to be priests, usually the Jesuits, and we'll get to some of them later. And I think it's very important, to be objective in studying it as a political phenomenon rather than just a system of faith, which is, as you just demonstrated, highly intertwined with Philippine life. Now, I'm curious, though, what are the precise questions that you started to ask in your research, given that it's part of your life? So how did you begin asking questions about it?
Simple. Because I as I said earlier, it is a matter of who the people are in my family tree. Then it's focused on personality. If it's focused on personality, it is now a representation of the leadership style, leadership quality, and the mechanisms that leadership or that leaders in that organization affect policy, programs, activities, whatnot. So what that essentially means is, because in my own experience, I have found that we put preferential treatments, if I may use that liberally, on certain influential people, whether they be influential because they're lawyers, doctors, or in this case, they might be religious. You suddenly realize that it's all about interpersonal connections.
Right.
And it's that interpersonal connections, those social contracts you make with people that actually dominate the engagement and control the form of power relations. What that means is it now goes beyond the faith, the FAITH. It now goes to social contracts.
Right.
And that social contract can be devoid of the religion, but not of the relationship. If it's a strong leader, strong personality, they're charismatic, or for that matter, they're convincing, and they are very much ever present, why not? Why not believe them? Why not follow them? So now, you can analyze them. You can compare their leadership style. You can look at their motivations. And you can appreciate them all as political actors.
Right.
Whether or not they're religious or not is not the question. If it affects them, that's a different category of questioning.
Okay.
But rather, it's a matter of how those who view it from the outside or those affected by those decisions somehow confuse that what is influencing or motivating these people is only their faith. Rather than it could be something else. Case in point,
Right.
I might be a religious and I might be making decisions for my parish. Let's say I'm the parish priest, but my decisions could very well be political in context. And that political in context does not necessarily mean because God wills it, because someone told me, an angel told me my prayer. It could be very well a factor of it is what's best for my community.
Yes, right. So religious leaders become not just like theological leaders, but also elites in the society in their own rights. You know, like same way.
Which is one way of analyzing organization. Because as far as Jules' approach is concerned, as far as I can summarize it, so first and foremost, we suspend the question of theology. We suspend the question of faith. So we look at religion as an organization, but going down the ladder of abstraction. So you specified further into the level of individuals, which is a very nuanced approach to analyzing religion, because it is easy to provide opinions at a religion as an organization. It is a different issue to provide a more nuanced analysis looking at not only leaders but also their relationships. So it provides a more dynamic perspective.
Yeah. Right. I'll give you one simple example that is actually very much represented in religious organizations themselves.
Right.
Ang seniority ng isang religious order nadidetermine ko ano ang degree ng member. So when you go to certain religious organizations, may mga role sila. Pwede ang role niya, gardener lang siya. Pwede ang role niya, siya yung mismong principal ng school na fina-found nila. Anong difference nun? Yun lang natapos niya. Yun yung area specialization niya. Because of that, may different privileges. You might both come from the same religious organization, but because you have a PhD, you have a law degree, you have other education, there is a likelihood ikaw magiging admin, ikaw mag-head ng congregation nyo, because you have the leadership training and all of that. And because you have the intelligence, competence, legitimacy, and more importantly, you have the social acceptability. Bakit natin siya piniling leader? May PhD siya. If I can segue, but it actually is applicable, Lasal right now, they're calling for sino yung next president, di ba? One of the requirement is may PhD. That's why the list of sino yung brothers na pwedeng mag-ano ng role na yon, number one requirement nila, may PhD sila. Bakit kailangan ng PhD? At preferably may teaching degree. Why? Christian's brothers is specializing in teaching. So it has to be reflective. It has to be representative. So if you are a religious and you have professional degrees, mas maganda ang buhay mo, quote-unquote, in that hindi ka i-require mag-manual labor as service to the community. You could be doing something else.
Right.
So it's again skills training, and that also denotes seniority. The fact that that is something observed in the religious, and it is also representative of what's in society, meaning mas maganda sweldo mo dahil mas marami kang degrees o mas may experience ka, mas merong kang skills, di ba? So it's the same. Again, tama si Borge in the context na that's why we call it theology. We're not calling it political science. Diba?
Right.
Eh, ang basis nga ng religion is philosophy. And how is that important in the context? Simple. Dahil, Borge, what's your definition of philosophizing?
Philosophizing? Well, basic definition would be thorough understanding, analysis. Basically, trying to think in solitude would be one.
Oh, everyone does that, especially in the context of decision making. Pag ikaw ang responsible person, guess what? Requirement yan pag parish priest ka. Diba? Ang trabaho ng parish priest more than anything, administrator po yan. Parang official na rin yan. Ano na rin, parang elected official. In this case, appointed siya or rise up to the ranks. Pero very similar ang structure niya. You could argue nga na naging inspiration yung structures niyan for other organizations to follow. By virtue of the organization proving that yung structure, yung plantilla roles, yung responsibility, delegation, it works.
Okay,
Right.
okay. Pero let's move outside the church as an organization. So going back to church
As
state.
personalities.
Yeah. Well, trying to go back to church state relations. Pero this time, I think one factor would be church state society relations. So it's more tried at this point. So any other examples of relationships between society, church, state? Kasi we're talking about individuals right now, but what about the relationships
Jaime
between
Cardinal Sin.
Yeah.
Jaime Cardinal Sin. What is Jaime Cardinal Sin's claim to fame?
Yeah, it's a one.
And what is EDSA 1 and 2? What is EDSA for that matter? It is the manifestation of what? Political will.
Basically, church clout.
Not necessarily church clout alone, but it has been justified as church clout for those who use that argument. Or,
right.
Di ba?
Pero na national level yan, meron ba tayo sa local level na relationships between church parishes or bishoprics with the local government units?
Meron. All the time yan, Borge. Kaya lang, the question is, at what capacity or level of engagement? I'll give you one good example. So, most parishes have social-civic activities, yes or no?
Meron.
Yes. So, they actually augment the livelihood programs of government agencies. So, it would not be it would not be odd to see in certain parishes na si mayor, sinusuportahan niya yung livelihood program niya na augment ng mga church charities. May ganong aspect. Tapos, one way is pwede yung top of my mind, kailangan ng simbahan ng volunteers. Pwedeng i-organize ng barangay yun for that aspect. Lalo na sa notion natin na yung parishes are integral in barangay operations. For the most part, fiesta. Gets niyo yun?
Oo.
Diba?
Meron pa bang ibang functions? Barangay level? Fiestas talaga sigurado. Sigurado. Always in coordination with the barangay office.
In times of calamity, saan nagtatago yung mga nasunugan?
Sa elementary school.
Pag hindi kinaya ng elementary school, simbahan.
Church grounds.
Diba? So may mga aspects na why are you allowing these types of functions? Diba? May aspect din yan ng augmenting services kagaya ng yung it's not uncommon to see Sunday school as a form as entry level to kindergarten bago pumasok sa public school yung mga bata. Diba?
Yeah.
Tinuturuan niya ng mga basic arithmetic, writing, whatnot. Diyan na yan. Or as a basic venue for livelihood programs in conjunction with barangay efforts. Yung mga ganyan yan Pero we have to understand that the limitation is always kung papayag ba yung bishop at kung in tandem ba siya dun sa simbahan. Ano yung man yung pinopromote nung goals ng church is in line. Magandang example niyan is when it's election time. You want a good example of barangay level? Sino bang unang nangangampanya pag sa linggo kung hindi ang pari mo? Diba? So pwedeng nagko-comment siya, pwede rin namang nag-a-approve at nag-encourage siya for people to participate. That is already in junction with with activities. Panahon ng election, PPCRV, Parish Pastoral Council, I always forget that. Diba? So, if you're looking for something, Borge, na religion or the religious and then affecting national yung counting ng ballot ng PPCRV. Diba?
I'm curious what you think about this, because what you clearly demonstrated is just like the colonial times, the clergy are intertwined with public life. Like what you said, it was in charity, education, public affairs, etc.
Yeah,
I'm curious. Yeah, I'm curious. Like, of course, clearly it's a force for development and good, but I wonder if what has changed that prevents it from being philocratic. Like, of course, there's the current constitutional system, which is like definition, separation of church and state, but are there other maybe internal mechanisms that prevents them from being philocratic or like clerico-cratic or something? Yeah.
Define mo philocratic, man.
It was a term used when the friars would control even public affairs during the time of, well, even before the time of Rizal. It was usually used by the propaganda movement, because of Frailocracy. Friars were the ones who made most of the public decisions.
Do you know why they made most of the public decisions?
Sila may educational background.
They had the administrative capacity because Governor General was military. A military cannot govern civilian affairs. Pero yung mga praile, there was the assumption that they had administrative duties separate and distinct dahil nakapag-aral sila eh. Na meron silang roles and responsibilities. Whether or not that was true or not, but that was the intent. Again, we only have one side of the narrative, but we only have the Philippine perspective. You go to other areas, there is a necessity for administration of services, right? Sinong kukunin mo? Then you have to deputize people who understand the process. If it happens that they are religious, the rule right now is they are not supposed to perform their duties as a religious. But they have the qualifications to be civil servants.
Right.
So hindi natin masasabi, but this was the understanding. They are doing civil service, but they're not supposed to do it in conjunction with the religious. Di ba?
Okay.
Because,
supposedly,
because that's the rule. But how are we to say, baka before, there was no rule? Again, I'm not as familiar with that part of history, but I'm not justifying it, but if I was the king of Spain far away, who would I rely on? Then I would rely on the educated people with training, with background that know how to administer. But I cannot rely on soldiers to do government work. Case in point, our current experience right now. You're asking military people to be policy makers, policy creators, policy crafters. They have experience, but not necessarily on all of those issues. Peace and security, definitely area nila yan. But beyond that, unless meron silang MBA, unless meron silang specific degrees on things like that, mahirapan nating expect or even justify yung kanilang roles. But they know management, definitely, because they have experience in organizational developments.
Right.
But only in their structure. So going back to colonial era, perhaps one way to look at it is, sino nga asahan nila?
May bureaucratic vacuum.
Bingo, Borge got it. The issue with bureaucratic vacuum, believe it or not, is the language of the law. So ano yun? Kailangan mo turuan yung mga lay. Eh kung ang iyong business language is in Spanish, tuturuan mo ba yung kinolonize mo mag-Spanish?
Yeah.
Diba?
Minimal cooperation.
Yun. So what could happen is ang nagde-decide or ang nagma-manage or nag-organize yung mga praile. But they might have people working for them at tinasabihan nila, ito gagawin mo, ito gagawin mo. They might not explain, but nila gagawin yun. Basta gawin nila. Case in point, pwedeng, ikaw, tax collector ka. Ikaw yung tagalinis ng kwadra, ng kabayo, whatever. Nag-administer ka na ng roles, may sweldo ka, may ganyan ka, whatever. They might do those administrative things. Dahil lack of manpower, lack of competent individuals. So may ganong aspect siya eh. We cannot take that out. Dahil ano siya, even if you were affluent at that time, affluence does not assure education. Never forget that, especially colonial era. You could be rich simply because of connections, power, di ba? Ganon. Plus, there is also the aspect of who has authority on property. Hindi ba ang religious orders ang merong titles? Land titles.
Church lands.
Di ba? So, sino mag-a-administer niyan? Hindi yung military government. Yung mga pare. So, again, merong other layer yan. So, if you're using that context of from that experience to now, that could confuse people. what I believe you're actually meaning, what you're hinting at, or I'm just assuming, Matt, what you're talking about is yung how is it that there are still religious people who have that influence and essentially are influencing people of
Right.
people who are captains of industry, people
Mhm.
of power, influence, and politics, di ba?
Mm.
So, yun yung ating malamang pinag-uusapan. The simplest answer is paano lumaki
Mhm.
at paano na-indoctrinate yung tao.
Mm.
Pagdating
Yes.
sa kanyang quote-unquote buhay bilang Philippine Roman Catholic.
Mhm.
There is that
Yeah.
aspect. But
Right.
but now, if we say that, that only limits us to Philippine Roman Catholic. Automatic,
Right.
tanggalin mo na yung mga politiko na hindi Roman Catholic.
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm. I mean, of
Because
course.
you're hyper-focused on Roman Catholicism.
Right.
So if you're talking about the influence of Roman Catholicism, are you asking it now? Are you asking it 30 years before? Because definitely iba na ang composition ng ating legislators,
Right.
yung kanilang religious composition. At the simplest analysis is even how we even put forth church issues on the forefront or not at the forefront
Mhm.
is a signifier na not necessarily nagway ng influence nila, pero it's not something that even the public would be much of concern. Hindi niya concern
Right.
eh.
Mhm. Yeah, because most church and state issues that the public or the normal student would fear would be, church meddling in certain issues like, say, for instance, reproductive health, abortion,
Divorce.
divorce, etc. Against usually progressive issues. So I'm curious, like, what you can say. Can you say about that in Philippine society? How does this Roman Catholic Church? That's what we're focusing on right now. Does
Okay,
it still have the same kind of sway in issues like that?
so the thing to understand is the context is religious or the religion influencing the decision of a member, right? Who happens to be someone of political clout or financial clout or whatever power in society.
Right.
That is always the fear. That is always the concern. Simple discussion. If we talk of one person making a decision, that would make sense. But you tend to overlook the simple. I'm not talking about you guys, but I'm talking this in general. You as the average person tend to overlook the fact that hindi lang isang tao nagde-decide para sa bansa. There will always be a forms of balances or there are forms of reassurances. And that is what has been happening. Case in point. If we're going to focus on an issue, pick an issue, man.
Let's say
Want divorce?
Sure.
Ang reproductive health is no longer an issue because we have a reproductive health law.
Already, yeah.
So it's not an issue na.
Right.
So let's talk about divorce. So what is the issue with divorce? Many people want to have divorce and sabihin na natin, are there enough people of influence who want divorce? That is the question, man. Are there enough people who can make that vote? Because if there are,
mga artista.
Anyway.
Manalo muna sila ng eleksyon.
Okay.
Maging senador sila, maging presidente sila, maging congress people sila.
Right.
Then they decide, then make those laws. The question has always been a misunderstanding of how much influence Roman Catholicism has. But we are still waiting for someone to prove is there such a thing as a Roman Catholic vote.
Yeah, yes. Pero naisip ko lang sa issue ng divorce. Given tama yung tanong mo, gaano ba karami sa mga representante natin ang gusto ng divorce? Another additional question to that one is, again, political dynastic dynamics are based on marriage. If if divorce is legalized, there's a possibility that political dynasties or the current schema of using marriage as part of consolidating dynastic claims may be in power. So ayun na naman yan. So
Ako meron lang akong isang naughty thinking. thinking out naughty, my imagination going
Yeah.
overdrive. There is one word that comes into mind. Bakit merong resistance? Alam niyo kung ano? Merong quote-unquote prenuptial agreement. Dahil ang sikreto niyan, believe it or not, because we recognize prenuptial agreements, that in itself could be detrimental to divorce. Diba? Nahuli si Mister na may kabit. Wala na pera niya. Diba?
Right.
Maraming karir maraming bulsa mabubutas. Maraming bulsa mabubutas.
Ako, I have no proof, but in my naughty imagination, baka kasi marami sa mga, you just said, Borge, marriage is a form of solidifying power. What if there is a prenup? And then that prenup augments, strengthens divorce proceedings. Would you want to be caught losing everything? Wag nang mag-divorce.
So basically, dapat sisihin pa sa kawalan ng
prenup.
That's one thing. Pero dapat sisihin sa kawalan ng divorce sa Pilipinas ay yung mga politiko na ayaw o madaling mahuli at pwede i-divorce agad ng mga asawa nila.
Before we get too far from the topic, but just know that certain Roman Catholic issues are more complicated than the role of the church and the teachings of the church. There are apparently extra legal issues.
Very true. Again, sa divorce, it's a matter of if you want it to pass, then vote enough people in the legislature who will vote for that act.
Was nothing to lose with divorce.
Who
have nothing to lose, who have everything to gain with a divorce.
All right. So we moved on from like how the clergy is integrated in public and private life and the echelons of power. Let's move on to perhaps what we see around us, I think, more closely right now with, at least in the age of Duterte, how the Roman Catholic Church not only faces like more or less dwindling numbers, but also facing a pluralistic kind of like religious society. It's like there are more denominations affecting the makeup of the Congress and even society. So I'm curious, do you have a comment on the more contemporary, like I would say, dynamics of Catholic power here in the Philippines right now with the rise of mega churches, election?
We are in the age of cults. That is my comment. We are in the age of cults of personalities. So what I mean by this is, you might in your CV say they're your Roman Catholic, but you are being influenced by a person, a belief set, and ideology beyond your religion. And that has weight over everything else. And that cult or thinking or mindset that you have now adopted and are now freely expressing is what's making you decide beyond the confines of your faith. Case in point, we even developed the term politically correct, political correctness. Political correctness takes away history, takes away context, takes away culture, and focuses on what? Whatever is in vogue.
Yes,
political correctness is an application of what is in right now. So if it's politically correct to be of a certain race, age, culture, gender, or to be of a certain community or society, good for you. If you essentially, we are now in an age wherein inclusivity, the more inclusive you are, the more exclusive your group becomes. Because you have already identified who the outsiders are. Because you've highlighted them. The more you highlight what you are, the more you reflect what you are not. And now all your choices are self-serving. I'll give you one simple example of that. How is it that we require someone to have experience, and yet we would rather hire newly graduates because we pay them cheaper? So given that context, how will you get experience if you are newly graduate And how will that corporation develop people? Simple. You indoctrinate new people inside your organization. And when you indoctrinate those new people, that indoctrination now becomes their new faith, their new belief, their new mindset. And that new mindset now guides them because they don't know anything else. Meaning, the experience they gain is in fact indoctrination. Dahil wala silang prior, they have nothing to compare it with.
Right.
So, kung ikaw ay, ang experience mo is as a laborer, mahihirapan ka unless may further education ka to do managerial skills. Pero ang tanging trabaho na open is managerial skills. Anong gagawin mo? So tatanggapin mo na lang hanggat umabot ka sa punto na yon. But that now leads you to have a limited or a tunnel vision of expectation, knowledge, and expertise. Same thing when it comes to idea and cults and cultures. Kung yun lang ang exposure mo, kung limited lang ang nakikita mo, na-understand mo, hanggang doon ka lang, unfortunately. Case in point, the average student we have right now would likely learn more from social media access, meaning from their social media devices, then go to Then go to broadsheets. Because everything has already been filtered. Madali na siya eh. Marami tayong distractions sa buhay, marami tayong diversions, or marami tayong kailangan gawin. Everything is fast, everything is hectic. So doon ka pupunta kung saan may abbreviation. Problem is, if you're going to the abbreviated version, you might be missing a lot more. And now, unintentionally, that's what's been created. So if what you are reading is now being reinforced repeatedly, yun lang alam mo. You don't know anything else. Magandang example niyan is the rise of fake news. Diba? So I'll give you one good example related to church and state. So there is always the assumption that hindi tinatax ang simbahan. Palagay niya hindi tinatax ang simbahan.
Hindi ba dapat?
Alamin natin muna, what do we mean by simbahan? Are we talking about the building? Are we talking about the organization? Are we talking about those related services that essentially operate? How about certain properties? How about certain owned items by the church? There is actual legislation that has preferential treatment with regards to taxation on certain matters related to the religious. May mga certain privileges. But you cannot say na fully tax-free sila. Anything to do with religion. Magandang example niyan is, pag ikaw ay magpapakasal, may fee, di ba? Palagay niya hindi tinatax yun?
Yeah, as far as I know. May taksa?
Tinatax yun.
Huh?
May resibo eh. Ba't ka gagawa ng resibo? More than 20 pesos yun eh. O matinong usapan, Borge. Kailangan ba pare para maging receptionist, accountant ka sa simbahan? May sweldo yun. Palagay mo hindi tinatax yun?
May tax rin yun. Okay.
Right.
So pag bumili ang simbahan, sa palagay mo hindi sila tinatax. Let's say bumili ng kotse yung simbahan, may tax yan.
Okay.
Pero may mga certain services and functions that they might not be taxed. Case in point, sila may-ari ng lupa. So hindi ako sure kung kailangan sila magbayad ng amilyar. I'm not sure about that.
Right.
Pero pag sila ay may school, tinatax yung school.
School
eh.
Okay.
Hello.
Right.
So,
dude, you are in a Catholic school. Faculty ka ng Catholic school.
Classifiable na enterprise siya.
So,
May
diba?
business tax.
Enterprise siya.
Right.
Okay.
So, again, even yung even foundations may level ng tax yan. So again, ika-clarify natin anong level. So but because na-reinforce yung certain privileges that they had before. May ganun. Definitely.
Yeah.
I'm not sure now, pero professional taxing priest, hindi ko alam yung kung ano yung rule dyan. Dahil case in point, nag-hire ka ng pare para mag-misa para sa'yo. Sinisweldoan mo ba siya? Hindi. Binaabutan mo lang siya. Di ba?
Right.
So hindi mo tinatax yun dahil inabutan mo lang siya.
Right. I think right now this discussion has broken a lot of stereotypes with regards to church and state relations. I'm curious, like, as someone who has studied it so much and who still continues to observe and experience, uh, if someone, like for instance, a student wants to begin a similar track, studying church and state relation as a social and political phenomenon, what would you tell that person, especially now how the dynamics have changed? Because
Pick an
yeah,
issue.
it has changed.
Pick an issue. It
Mm-hmm.
is always about pick an issue. Pick a case study.
Okay.
Pick your battles, ika nga. Don't
Mm-hmm.
don't look at it as one
Block.
big conspiracy.
It's
You
not a
will
monolithic
ano siya, mamili ka lang ng gusto mong i-analyze. Isang bagay na magandang i-analyze na people are not doing is the actual contribution of the religious to education. People are forgetting, or to knowledge production. And yet, ang daming na-contribute ng Christianity sa progress ng science. Diba?
Yeah.
So people forget there is a Vatican observatory.
Yeah, so
Or they might not even know that.
In a nutshell, the issue between church and state is far more complex. Well, it's far more complex. Not only multiple levels within the relationship itself, but context-wise, as nabanggit mo nga kanina, that we are living in an age of cults. So the church-state relations must be understood not only as a dynamic relationship, but also set in a dynamic context. That the church must now, to an extent, relate with other denominations.
Yeah. There's also one clarification I have to give you guys. So, if you want to begin your study about church and state relationship in the Philippines, the first thing you have to learn, appreciate, and delve into is the Catechism of the Filipino Church. Because that separates tradition and culture, that makes it endemically Filipino. The second is the organization and structure of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, which, believe it or not, is more similar in atmosphere to our own politicians. Because we always say it's the church as if it's united. No. We say it's one big entity, one voice. No. Because the Catholic Bishops' Conference, it is an organization made up of bishops, and each one of them has their own opinion. They have their own commentary. They have their own agenda specific to their parish, to their parishioners. They have their own experiences, biases, preferences, and all of that. If in fact there is a dissenting opinion, it usually comes from one of them all, from one of their own. But if there is a united front, there is a common cause, and because we have had an experience multiple times, essentially, in our Philippine experience, that focuses to that kind of unified voice, feel natin iisa sila. But that's not true. You have to clarify that. Na, when we talk of the church, are we talking again about the institution or the people that run it? In the Philippines, as long as there is a dissenting opinion in the membership of the CBCP, it is difficult to say it's one voice.
Kaya nga eh. Isang example din yan. Again, we need to tackle such organizations as something more dynamic. I think one of my friends did study yung INC vote. So he also tried to break the myth of an INC vote. Some conclusion dyan is they have their own polling systems. They would only cast supposedly a vote to someone who would probably win. Hence, perpetuating that myth na nakakapanalo ang INC vote for the past few decades. Which hindi nangyari noong 2013 yata, I think.
One thing that I have found in the narrative of church and state is people confuse when we talk of church and state, is it church versus state? No. There is no rivalry, there is no conflict. But it is a factor that people assume there is because of how the Constitution phrases it. Most students, that's the first time they hear it. The separation, negative po ang term na separation eh. The separation of church and state is inviolable. The word, the sentence, the phrasing itself emanates from this is bad, That's why it
Right.
has to be done. That's the
And
confusion.
it's ideologically loaded, which is based on a
Yes.
long tradition of liberalism. Na
Yes.
separation is basically
and
separation is just a middle ground between separation and actually destroying the church.
yes, and that's why the simplest way to if you're a Sunday school boy, girl, Sunday school person, if you have had the experience of Sunday school, one of the things they teach you: give to Caesar what is due to Caesar, give to God what is due to God. That's the separation of church and state. What that means is you have your own responsibility for each. Meaning, if you're atheist, sure, why not? Just give to the state what's to the state. And if you have a higher being, go to a higher being. If you don't have a higher being, we won't judge. Long story short, you focus your energies on the area that will merit you most. And there is no judgment whatsoever on how you perform those duties. Case in point, when you are a member of the Roman Catholic Church, you actually undergo 3 processes before you are fully Roman Catholic. Supposed to be. So yun yung baptism mo, the baptism, confirmation, and then whether or not you will get married or whether or not you will become a religious, yun yung mga levels how deep you are into your Roman Catholicism. That's always the process. So if you are unmarried, you haven't reached the final communion with Christ because you are not sharing it with your spouse. Or if you become a religious, ganun yun.
Okay.
So, but that has been the traditional mindset.
Right.
But then again, because of changing times and appreciations, we also change timelines and preferences. How so? Simple lang yan. Wala naman tayong forced rule na dapat ikasal ka eh. Diba?
Tacit rules. Unnamed
rules.
rules, but not encoded.
Oo, yun lang yun.
Right.
Social pressure.
Right.
More than anything, it is a need to continue your line. It's a question of legacy. May magmamana ba ng lupa mo, whatnot, than anything else. Or, bakit ka nagkaroon ng anak? Para may mag-alaga sa akin pag matanda na ako. So again, different reasons yan, di ba?
All right.
Also, I would like to clarify something that we actually glossed over. Post-Vatican II, we changed the perception of how the church is involved. Magandang example niyan is pre-Vatican II. My dad remembers nakatalikod sa iyo ang pare because the Mass is offered to Jesus.
Right.
Post-Vatican II, the Mass is including the people, the community, offering it together to Christ. So may ganon.
Right.
Yung pag-i-incorporate ng tao now focuses on social engagements because there is the context and concept. Magkaiba kasi yun eh. Ang concept kasi is the church is the moral guardian of society, of the Roman Catholic society.
Right.
Ang context nun is because you learn your values, you learn ethics and morality first through the context of religion, through the examples of the religious stories, and through the values promoted by the Ten Commandments, so forth and so on. Yun yung context nun eh. Pag tinuro kasi sa'yo yun, magkakaroon ka ngayon ng rules to live by as a decent, moral, ethical person.
Right.
Kaya, by promoting that, you have the context now of it being the guardian of morality.
Right.
And that's where people suddenly feel may crossing of boundaries.
Yun
They feel that the church says bawal to, that's against my human rights because you're telling me I cannot do this. Well, technically, legally binding ba yung sinasabi niya? No, of course not. But because it mirrors legislation or laws, you suddenly feel it is impinging on your right to choose or not to choose. Magandang example niyan is the rule na you shall have no God before me. So those who are very philosophical, automatic, why are you forcing your religion on me? Not realizing na these laws more than likely apply only to an already formed Roman Catholic person.
Yun nga eh. So even if you separate church and state, ideally speaking, it is quite impossible to keep them away from each other.
Right.
History tells that.
Well, there is a way,
Yeah.
dude. There is a way.
Mm-hmm.
Convert somewhere, convert to another religion.
But that would be another church.
Right. And speaking of which, this has been a very fruitful discussion, but I suppose we have to start wrapping this up. So I suppose the last few questions. I suppose, Borge, maybe you can offer one last question, and then I'll have one more, and then we can go to recommendations. So, do you have anything?
I think that's the question that we had earlier would be, is it necessary? Is it necessary? Is the separation of church and state necessary for a democratic society?
So, first is, himayin natin ang tanong mo. Loaded actually tanong mo, Borge. First, no, honestly, it's actually loaded. So, is the separation of church and state, meaning is the involvement of church in politics or non-involvement of church in politics necessary for democratic society? Ganun ba yun?
Na
Is that one way?
No, democratic state.
If it's in the rules, yes. If it's not in the rules, it depends on how that democratic society appreciates the contribution of the religious faith in their community. Bigyan ka ng example. We're talking about democratic societies, right? So what is a democratic society? You can define it based on how they elect their leaders, or do you define it on how they conduct themselves in a social, in a society?
Yeah.
Okay, iba yun eh. So, we'll go to the Viking countries. The Viking countries are democratic, but they are socialist. If you're democratic, but your society operates on a socialist, walang religion doon. Dahil social contract lang yun eh. It is your contribution, your commitment to society. Definitely, separation of church in politics, tama yun in their context. Pero, if you are on a fledgling community state, bago ka lang gawa, newly evolved into a new democratic archetype ka, ano ang kukopyahin mo? Saan ka magkukuha ng mga inspirations mo? Saan ka magkakaroon ng iyong guidelines? Not necessarily rules of conduct, but more like inspirations.
At the very least.
At the very least. Case in point, something we've talked about before. There is the separation of church involvement, but there are practices that are inspired by church conduct, church activities, integrated in the democratic process. The swearing of on the Bible, things of that nature. Having prayers before session, somehow that's an aspect of it. When you are invoking the higher power, why are you invoking the higher power? Because it is remembering a time when ruling or the rule is God-given. So may ganun siyang context. But if it's just tradition, it's a formality, sure. But again, we have to separate kung ano yung engagement. Is it necessary for the Philippines? Yun ang talagang tanong mo. Is, quote-unquote, non-involvement of the Roman Catholic Church in Philippine politics a requirement for us to continue our democracy? According to what is promoted by both sides, non-involvement in what aspect? If it is involvement in actual political realm, influencing people's votes, that is a gray area. But if they are, quote-unquote, indoctrinating people to actually make hard decisions to favor their processes, that is illegal. Meaning, nagsermon yung pare, bigyan nyo ng incentive ang simbahan. Kung hindi, i-excommunicate kita. Yung ganong kind ng influence na ganon, mali yun. Pero, ang pag-i-influence through lobbying, through prayers, to other practices, that's the gray area wherein it is actually encouraged because it's called spiritual inspiration. Or it is also called voters lobbying. The moment pinagbawal mo yun, tinatanggal mo na ngayon ang freedom of speech. Because nasa democratic process ka di ba? Dahil ngayon, sinilence mo ang critic mo.
Right.
So may mga ganong gray areas tayo. Because we consider, people forget that the Roman Catholic Church is part of civil society. Therefore, it must also continue to have a voice in civil society affairs. So if the involvement is about being critical of government programs and services, and even of politicians and leaders, then we should encourage that. Why are they critical? Because they're thinking of the betterment of the Filipinos. Case in point, nag-criticize sila against the extrajudicial killings. Didisallow na ba natin yun? Eh di ba nga gusto natin? Right? Yung nag-comment sila na we should maintain our sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea. Ay, dahil simbahan nagsalita yan, di-discount na natin yan. Di ba? O how about people's access to news and information? Nagsalita simbahan na against sila sa pag-close ng ABS-CBN. Di-discount na ba natin yun dahil simbahan sila? We have to be careful on that account.
Right.
If you ask me, the moment they are actually doing it for the benefit of just them, that is something I cannot accept. But if they're doing it for using the term betterment of all or the betterment of its flock, hindi natin pwede gamitin public good eh. Sabihin na natin yung to improve the lives of its congregation. We have to consider because sinama natin sa civil society eh. Because it's a part of civil society, hindi natin siya pwedeng ihiwalay sa engagement with the government. And many people have not actually thought of it from that perspective. Again, nilagay natin sa civil society.
I think that is a great end to this session. It's been very educational for me personally, actually, also. In fact, there's a lot to digest and work on, but hopefully you'll be back. But for now, let's close this episode with a segment called Recommendations. Where both the hosts and the guest would recommend supplementary material. It could be a movie, video, book, or website, or whatever that can help digest and supplement the discussion we just had. So as the guest, I'll allow Jules to go first. What do you have to recommend our listeners?
Now, if our listeners would like to have an example of essentially church involvement in civil society affairs that is in fact a response to government policy, Gawad Urian Award movie Sister Stella.
Sister Stella.
Ano nga ba yun? Sister Stella L. Kay Vilma Santos. Nanalo to ng Gawad Urian. Now, ang kwento ni Sister Stella L is essentially about labor. So sumama si Sister doon sa the-demand ng labor rights ng mga manggagawa at yung sabay sa laban ng karapatan ng mamamayan, ng mga workers. So, what gives it personally, ganito na lang. Pag ang isang miyembro ng simbahan at in-encourage siya mismo ng kanyang kaparian, ng kanyang parish, na ang kanyang activity, ang kanyang social engagement is for socio-civic development and improvement, automatic yan, it is endorsed, espoused, and promoted by the church because it's for the betterment of the Catholics, of Philippine Roman Catholics. Sister Stella L. promoted human rights, promoted labor rights. Madre talaga siya. Yun yung pagka-present sa kanya.
Right.
At may inspiration yan based on a real story talaga yan. And it showcases that the church takes care of its people as best as it can. It involves itself in private policy and even in government services intervention because labor is di ba? It's a government function to provide labor. to provide opportunities for people. And on a private sector is dapat an employer should treat its workers based on the contract that they have signed, based on the conditions. And the fact na isang religious is espousing these values, yes, she's still religious. Yes, she's believing in the faith because, simple, because it's the right thing to do, because it's the moral thing to do, because take care of your neighbor, assist them, and so forth. Because it's a cause that needs to be fought for. Maganda siya. Panoorin niyo siya. Very dramatic siya. And I believe Daily Motion ata, Vimeo, baka may yan. May access yan. Problema, ngayong narinig nyo, ikakat na nila yan. So, try nyo na i-download. No, Sister Stella L is a good movie. I have another follow-up movie. Another good na Philippine example ng church and state is, lalo na yung, because you're talking about colonial, yung, it's not really religious, pero how certain nuances affected is yung, wait. Mauna nga kayo, nakalimutan ko yung title. Sige.
Okay. When you get it, we'll get back to you.
Google.
Gorge. Okay, Gorge.
Yeah, okay. In line with Jules, one of Jules' point earlier on regarding the dynamics of the CBCP, again, we should not look at the CBCP as this monolithic entity. So I have here a short book by Dr. Demeterio entitled Ang mga ideolohiyang politikal ng Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines. So it's basically a survey of speeches from different points in our history that more or less tries to survey the different political stances that the CBCP took. So maybe pre-martial law, during the martial law itself, post-Marcos, then during Cardinal Sin's tenure as one of the leading members of it. So yeah, I think that's my recommendation for it. The church-state relations. So Jules exposed the governance part of it. So we cannot really ignore the ideological dimension, the relationship.
Okay, I think you did a review on that actually, right?
Yeah, I did. Way back.
Where can they buy it? Where they can buy it?
It's a De La Salle University publishing house. So again, buying it is a bit difficult, but it's available in the Dealership Publishing House.
Okay. I suppose our recommendations, almost by God's grace, fit together perfectly. I have two recommendations here. One is Rhetorics of Sin by Mary Jeanette Pinzon. And it talks about, I think, a figure that was mentioned quite a few times in the discussion, Jaime, Cardinal Sin. And this one talks about how he was very much a maverick and how he was both a progressive voice and who organized and made EDSA 1 and 2 possible. But at the same time, he wasn't necessarily just a stooge of the Vatican, because on several occasions, he actually disobeyed the Vatican. In fact, EDSA 2, just before the few days of EDSA, according to this book, the Vatican ordered him not to get involved, but he did anyway.
In EDSA 2 or EDSA 1?
EDSA 2, I think. Yeah. According to this book, it's in the University of the Philippines Press. So it's, think of it this way. He was, would you agree that he'd probably be like the two figures I have in mind is Cardinal Richelieu, who is like the Three Musketeers. He was also a diplomat and a cardinal. But at the same time, I don't know, it's considered Machiavellian, in such a way. He's an interesting figure. But anyway, what do you think?
Richelieu, probably not, because Richelieu was the state. He was the state. He was the state. So well. Cardinal Sin was, to an extent, but also to an extent outside. So that was his contribution. He was both inside and outside. That's why he was able to organize EDSA 1.
Right. Yeah, he's an interesting figure, and he deserves a bit more attention, actually. So yeah, very interesting. And then the other I have here is Church, State, and Civil Society in Post-Authoritarian Philippines. Now, most memories of the church and most people that say that church is colonial and is backward and is an archaic institution. They hate the church. But this book actually shows in a way that it was responsible for a lot of progressive elements in our society, not only participating in EDSA, but also in reforms in issues like environmentalism, the fight for human rights, farmers' rights, etc. In other words, the church is involved in in citizenship. The subtitle is Narratives in Engaged Citizenship. It was written by Antonio F. Moreno, S.J. So he's a Jesuit. As you can see, the Jesuits have not only been scientists but also scholars in church-state relations. So of course he's a bit biased, but I think his material is very good in understanding the nuance and the progressive role that the church has played in Philippine politics. Yes, it has been regressive, but it's also been progressive. So it's a bit of a gray area, as discussed here. So it's a very interesting book. Hope you can get it. It's also the Ateneo Press. So yes, Jules, did you find your second
Yeah.
recommendation?
Yeah. Matatawa si Borge dahil Borge, magagalit sa akin si Ma'am Fanny. Nakalimutan ko Himala.
Oh, Himala, a classic.
Si magagalit si Ma'am Fanny sa akin. So si Ma'am Fanny Garcia was one of the screenwriters nung Himala.
Right.
Magagalit sa akin si Ma'am, nakalimutan ko yung title ng Himala. So something na parang real world, something that we can touch base on was yung my earlier comment. Again, the listeners magugulat sila because Borch and Matt, very academic yung mga nila. Ako naman, things that are something na mas madali ma-absorb, ma-appreciate because it has more to do with the visual representation of the storytelling. Doon sa Sister Stella L, it is how the church, through its agents, operates to promote the welfare of its constituents in the real world. That's a good example. Ito namang Himala is actually it is a representative of an age-old narrative of people abusing their faith for personal advancement. Maganda siyang warning movie for those that it is a boogeyman story wherein your religion could co-opt your own life and then it's being abused in order to take advantage of others. And it is because of the church's ability or the faith, yung paniniwala, yung mga belief sets coming from that religion and how it impacts people and how it can be used to manipulate people's choices, decisions, motivations, and even their judgment, better judgment, is why we should always separate church and state because it has that influence, because it has that ability to co-opt, to make you act beyond reason. That's why I'm recommending it. This is what happens when people take the logic and reason and just focus on faith belief systems. Kaya siya delikado eh. One is a story that the church is your friend. Another one is a story of we can abuse what we learn from church to take advantage of others. Cautionary tale and a PR tale, so to speak, of church and state involvement in social-civic and Philippine experience. And both of them are awarded films. And again, may Vilmanian at merong mga Nora Honor, Pangaranyans. Yan. Para walang magalit.
Great. So thank you. Wow. Great recommendations. So that has been a very full and very enriching episode of the PI podcast. So if you enjoyed more of Jules' talk, where can they do you want to promote anything? Where can they find you? Or maybe you could just come back on the show again? Or
back to the show na lang.
Food security
yeah, that's a very interesting
nagmamahal ang presyo ng baboy.
Wait, tinanggal ng tariff ngayon.
Pero mataas pa rin. Mataas pa rin yan.
Imported na baboy nga lang.
Okay. So, yes. So, thank you for joining us in this I think it's the longest episode we have, but it's very enriching, we will, so it's, please do follow us in Facebook, Spotify, Anchor, and even send us an email at pipodcastph@gmail.com. And thank you very much right now. But until the next episode,
magandang gabi, mga ka-PI.